Ethan Cole hadn't expected to return to Maple Falls so soon, especially not to find a violation notice taped to his grandfather's porch for a flag that had stood for decades. The paper fluttered in the warm morning breeze, its neon yellow color clashing against the white siding like a warning flare. Ethan's fingers hesitated before peeling it off, eyes narrowing as he read the typed citation. Section 7B, 2 flagpole exceeds permitted height. Must be removed or adjusted within 10 days. The bolded words, final notice, were underlined twice. He folded the paper, the corners crinkling in his fist. The porch still smelled like old wood and lemon oil, like his childhood summers spent here when his parents needed a break. It hadn't changed, same creaky boards, same rocking chair with the crochet cushion his grandmother had stitched before the arthritis one. And at the end of the gravel path, the flagpole stood tall and steady, an American flag catching the light just as it always had. Inside, Frank was at his usual post, the kitchen nook overlooking the front yard, a black coffee in one hand, the Louisville Ledger in the other. A half-eaten cinnamon Danish sat on a chipped plate beside a transistor radio quietly murmuring the 7 a.m. news. He didn't look up as Ethan walked in. "That from the HOA?" Frank asked, flipping a page. Ethan held up the notice. "They say the pole's too tall now." Frank snorted. "That pole's been there since '89. Back when Margaret Hensley still wore denim skirts and had a crush on the mayor." Ethan cracked a faint smile. "You serious?" Frank folded the paper neatly and set it aside. "Dead serious. Dug the hole myself. Mixed the concrete, sealed it in place. Didn't hear a peep for 30 years. Ethan glanced down the hall. A black and white photo hung between two framed Navy commendations, a much younger Frank, crisp in his Marine uniform, eyes sharp as he hoisted that very flag into the Kentucky sky. The day passed slowly, heat settling like dust. By early afternoon, the quiet buzz of lawnmowers and sprinklers gave way to the crunch of polished flats on gravel. Ethan looked up from pruning the hydrangeas to see Margaret Hensley marching up the path. Clipboard tucked under her arm, she was dressed in her usual navy slacks and beige blouse, her bun pulled tight enough to give her an edge. "Afternoon," she said brightly, as if they were old friends rather than reluctant neighbors. "You must be Ethan." "I am," he said, rising. "We weren't expecting company." Margaret smiled, eyes scanning the porch like she was mentally inventorying a crime scene. "I was just making my rounds. Thought I'd stop by and welcome you home. Saw the car in the drive. I trust you've had a chance to review the Evergreen Meadows handbook." "Not yet," Ethan replied, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Been a little busy settling in." "Well, it's quite thorough," she said, already flipping through the pages on her clipboard. Section 7B covers vertical fixtures. Flagpoles must not exceed 12 feet. Yours is 16, give or take. Non-compliance, unfortunately. Frank appeared behind the screen door, arms crossed. "That flagpole's seen more 4th of Julys than you've held bake sales, Margaret." She didn't blink. "And I respect your service, Frank. We all do. But rules are rules. Funny how the rules didn't matter till you became president." Ethan watched the exchange quietly, tension coiling low in his gut. He wasn't used to seeing Frank this way, bristling beneath the surface but holding the line. It was like watching a retired lion sizing up a yapping dog. Margaret cleared her throat, extracted a manila envelope from her clipboard, and extended it with both hands. "This is a formal citation. You have 10 days to comply, or we'll have to escalate." Ethan accepted it silently. The envelope was heavier than expected, stamped, signed, and highlighted in pink. Margaret smiled again, overly bright. "If you'd like," she said, "I can walk you through the handbook sometime. We're just trying to keep Maple Falls beautiful." Frank didn't move. Margaret turned, heels crunching over gravel as she strode off with mechanical grace. As she walked away, Frank mutters without looking up from his paper, "That pole's seen more action than her entire HOA board." Ethan figured the HOA would be tedious, not tactical. He hadn't planned to attend a community meeting during his first week back in Maple Falls, but when Frank set his coffee down that morning with a grimace and said, "You might want to see how the sausage gets made," Ethan found himself sliding into the passenger seat of Frank's truck without protest. The community hall was smaller than he remembered. Beige walls and flickering fluorescent lights made the room feel like a time capsule from 1992. A sagging banner with a pixelated eagle read "Evergreen Meadows, where order meets charm." Rows of plastic folding chairs were set in cautious semicircles, occupied by silver-haired residents clutching reusable water bottles and murmuring about lawn fungus or porch swing permits. At the back, a long folding table sagged beneath a tray of stale oatmeal cookies and a pot of coffee that had been left to die slowly on its burner. Frank took a seat in the second row, nodding stiffly at a few familiar faces. Ethan sat beside him, notebook in hand, more out of habit than need. Margaret Hensley stood at the podium. Her beige clipboard was tucked under one arm like a talisman. "Let's begin," she said, smiling with tight precision. "Thank you all for attending our May 5th meeting. It's always heartening to see such civic engagement." She launched into a spiel about community decorum, peppered with phrases like shared values, visual harmony, and preserving neighborhood integrity. Ethan noticed how each word rolled off her tongue like practice lines from a familiar script. She didn't blink. She didn't look down. It was performance wrapped in protocol. "And now," Margaret continued, "under new business, we have a safety concern brought to our attention involving a structural hazard located on Lot 14. A few heads turned. Frank didn't. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. "The fixture in question," Margaret went on, "presents both a visibility obstruction and a potential electrical hazard during storms. We understand it has been in place for many years, but bylaws must evolve to reflect contemporary standards. No names. No addresses. Just enough detail for everyone to know who she meant." Frank rose slowly. His voice was calm but cut through the murmurs like a flat blade. "That flagpole was permitted in 1989. Cemented under code. It's never caused an injury or complaint, until now." Margaret turned her gaze toward him, unflinching. "Mr. Cole, we appreciate your service and stewardship. However, our updated bylaws take precedence over historic exceptions. We are all subject to the same standards, regardless of installation date." "You weren't on the board in '89, Frank said evenly. "Don't pretend you know what was allowed." Walt Gentry, seated beside her at the board's folding table, shifted uncomfortably and adjusted his glasses. His lips parted as if to speak, but Margaret raised a hand gently, not to silence him, just to assert control. "We've done our due diligence," she said. "And tonight, the board will vote on whether to escalate this matter to code enforcement for further action." There were murmurs, mostly soft, a few gasps. Ethan scanned the room. No one met his eyes. The neighbors seemed to fold into themselves like paper under light rain. The vote was brief. 4 hands up. 1 down, Walt's, unsurprisingly. Ethan barely remembered walking out. The air outside felt heavier than it should have. Frank stood quietly beside him, arms crossed, jaw tight. "These people," he muttered, "write rules like they're writing scripture. They only stop when someone burns the book." Before Ethan could respond, a voice called out behind them. "Ethan Cole. From Ms. Laramie's 6th grade class." He turned. Maya Branson stood just a few feet away, short curls tucked behind her ears, messenger bag slung across her shoulder, a press badge clipped to the strap. "Maya," he said, blinking. She grinned. "Knew it. You still chew the inside of your cheek when you're irritated." Ethan laughed once. "I guess I do. I've been covering HOA meetings for the Gazette," she said, eyes flicking toward the building. "They do this kind of thing more than you'd think. Frank's not the first. You've got records?" Maya gave him a look that said of course and then nodded toward her car. "I'll send you something tonight. Might help you understand what you're dealing with." He nodded, grateful and vaguely unsettled. They exchanged numbers. That evening, the house was quiet. Frank had gone to bed early, radio off, the flagpole still standing resolute outside in the dark. Ethan opened his laptop. One new message blinked in his inbox. From Maya. Subject line, "They've done this before. Want proof?" There were rules in Maple Falls, but they seemed to change depending on who you were, and who you knew. Rain tapped gently against the stained glass windows of the Maple Falls Public Library, its colors casting sleepy streaks across the hardwood floors. Ethan stepped inside, shaking off his jacket, and took in the quiet scent of aged paper and furniture polish. Rows of worn shelves stretched before him, standing like monuments to the town's curated memory. Maya was already waiting at a corner table, laptop open, a yellow legal pad filled with scrawled names and dates beside her. "I pulled the HOA meeting minutes from the past 12 years, she said without looking up. What I could get without a court order, anyway." Ethan dropped his backpack onto the seat and leaned over the pad. "This many amendments? Half of them don't even have signatures. Or proper vote counts," she said, clicking a tab on her browser. Some were added quietly, buried in subclauses. Like this one from 2015. Changed the maximum flagpole height from 15 feet to 10, citing aesthetic continuity. But no one seems to remember voting on it. Ethan scanned the lines and gritted his teeth. It's like they expect no one to care until it's too late. "They usually don't," Maya replied. "And when they do, the HOA counts on the hassle keeping them quiet." A whisper of footsteps interrupted them. The librarian, small-framed and silver-haired, approached and set down a bound copy of evergreen HOA bylaws, annotated history. She smiled, eyes gleaming with mischief behind thick glasses. "Don't let Margaret know I gave you this," she said in a low voice. "They pulled it from circulation last year. Said it was outdated." Ethan opened it to a dog-eared section. 2009, there it was. Case #122 Beef Widow Helen Crenshaw fined for unauthorized floor replacement, her rose bushes, too tall and a tripping hazard despite being along her private fence. "No wonder Helen moved away," Maya murmured. "I always thought it was because of her son." "No," the librarian said gently. "She left after they made her tear out every last flower." The rain had eased to a mist by the time Ethan returned home. Frank was in the garage, hunched over a crate that hadn't been opened in years. The room smelled of oiled metal and cedar, and a single bulb cast golden light on the workbench. A photo album lay open, pages crackling as Frank turned them. Ethan stepped in quietly. "We found something," he said. Frank didn't look up. "So did I." He tapped the plastic sleeve of a page. There, in grainy color, stood a younger Frank in uniform, arm around a tall, lean man with kind eyes, Clint Weaver. Next to them, a woman in fatigues, Diane, with an easy smile, and two others Ethan didn't recognize. "My unit," Frank said. "Most of us stayed close. Clint got into real estate law. Diane consults for nonprofits now. Others are scattered, but we keep track." Ethan raised a brow. "You think they'd still back you?" Frank gave a dry chuckle. "Clint said it himself last year, only time I wear a tie is for a funeral or a fight." He crossed to the workbench, picked up his flip phone, and dialed a number from memory. After a few rings, it clicked to voicemail. "This is Frank," he said, voice firm. "It's time." They didn't speak for a moment after he hung up. Outside, a distant lawnmower buzzed lazily through the damp afternoon. Just before dinner, the doorbell rang. A man in khakis and a county badge handed Ethan an envelope without a word. He didn't need to open it to know what it was. Inside, in block print. Notice of violation. Flagpole removal required within 5 business days. Failure to comply may result in fines or legal action. Ethan handed it to Frank in silence. The old man read it slowly, then folded it in half, ran a thumb across the crease, and looked toward the window where the flag still stood against the graying sky. "Let's see how they like following rules when we bring our own rulebook." The HOA had laws, but the veterans had lawyers. Sunlight filtered through the leafy maples in Frank's backyard, the scent of fresh-cut grass mixing with lemon iced tea and warm soil. A rooster from 3 yards over let out a scratchy crow, far too late in the morning to be useful, but no one minded. At the patio table, papers rustled in the breeze, certified mail receipts, folded ordinances, annotated HOA clauses, and a stapled printout of a Kentucky land use statute with 2 bright yellow highlights. Frank leaned back in his chair, an old Marine Corps ball cap shading his eyes. "Not a bad morning to dig some trenches," he said, tilting his glass of lemon iced tea in salute. Ethan gave a dry chuckle. "Just with footnotes and deadlines instead of foxholes." Clint Weaver adjusted his glasses and flipped another page in the binder spread open in front of him. His tan jacket bore the faded insignia of the 1st Marine Division near the shoulder, and the hat he wore had been through more than one Kentucky storm. His voice was even, practiced. "This here," he said, tapping the highlighted portion, "is your silver bullet. Under state law, any alteration to HOA bylaws that materially affects homeowners requires written notification and a 30-day review period. That 2015 clause about flagpoles? It was never circulated, certainly never voted on properly. That makes it legally voidable." Dee Simmons, seated across from him in a soft flannel shirt, nodded. She pulled a rubber-banded stack of folders from her canvas tote and placed them beside Clint's binder. "These are from the Burned Once Club," she said. 6 families, all cited for violations that didn't exist when they bought their homes. 1 got fined for a wooden planter. Another for hanging chimes on a shared fence. All of them quietly paid or moved out. None of them fought back. "Because that's been the strategy," Ethan said, leafing through one folder. "They wear people down. Death by paperwork." "Not this time," Dee said. "Not now." Frank stood and walked toward the kitchen, returning moments later with a new tray of tea and a folder marked with a single word, dispute. He handed it to Clint. "Certified mail goes out by noon," Frank said. "Stamped, tracked, and logged." Clint nodded approvingly. "That counts as official notice of your objection. Gives us the leverage to freeze their enforcement, especially since their violation notice violates due process." Ethan looked up from his notes. "So what's next?" "We up the pressure," Clint replied, straightening in his chair. "I'll send an order to cease and desist to the HOA's legal contact. If they act before this is resolved, they open themselves to civil liability. You keep documenting every interaction. Time, place, language. We're building a record." Dee lifted her phone. "And we build momentum. I'll organize the veterans potluck for next weekend. It's not just a dinner, it's a message. We'll invite residents who've been targeted and let them know they're not alone." Careful not to call it a protest, Clint added with a half-smile. "But if a few folks happen to bring notarized complaints." Frank sipped his tea. "Reminds me of a recon op back in '73. Low-key meat, high-value intel." Ethan smiled, but his fingers were already moving, typing into his laptop. Every name, every quote, every file reference was now logged into what he labeled Cole vs. HOA, legal journal. The calm of the afternoon held for a while longer, interrupted only by the soft shush of pages and the occasional creak of wooden chairs. Then, at exactly 2:17 p.m., Clint's phone buzzed. He answered, spoke few words, and hung up. They got the letter. Stamped at the HOA mailbox 2 minutes ago. Ethan exhaled. Frank gave a satisfied grunt. That night, the response came. Margaret didn't knock when she arrived. She didn't have to. Her voice floated over the hedges from the sidewalk where she stood like a courthouse statue. I'm calling an emergency board session, she declared. They want war. They'll get it, with code and conduct. Nothing builds unity faster than homemade cornbread and cold injustice. By late afternoon, the air in Maple Falls had taken on that soft golden hue only Kentucky spring could offer. Sunlight filtered through sycamore leaves, dappling the grass with gold coins that swayed when the breeze carried across the lake. In the park near Willow Bend, folding tables covered in gingham cloths sagged slightly under the weight of chicken-fried everything. Cast iron pans steamed beside foil-wrapped casseroles, mason jars of lemonade clinked with ice, and plates passed hand to hand in quiet rhythm. Dee stood near the foot of the picnic spread, her voice ringing clear. "Help yourselves, neighbors. There's sweet tea by the elm, cobbler near the bird bath, and the cornbread's already half gone." Laughter rose, genuine and, for many, unfamiliar. Ethan worked his way through the crowd with a recorder discreetly clipped to his shirt collar. He stopped at each lawn chair, each walker propped nearby, each familiar Maple Falls face. "Would you be okay sharing your experience with the HOA?" he asked gently. "You don't have to give names. Just your story." Some shook their heads, eyes dropping like shutters. But others began. Mrs. Alice Carmichael, wrapped in a quilt despite the warmth, rested her fork beside a sliver of pie. "They said my garden invited pests," she whispered. "But all I ever grew was lavender and tomato. I pulled it all up after the third letter. Frank was the only one who brought me a basket after." Ethan nodded. "May I record that?" She hesitated, then tilted her chin. "You can. About time someone wrote it down." Nearby, Mr. Harris adjusted the leash of a German shepherd wearing a red therapy vest. "They said rescue dogs needed approval." "Approval? She's the one who helped me walk again after the stroke." He patted the dog's flank. "Told me I was in breach of aesthetic standards. Whatever that means." Children darted between legs and chairs, their shouts lifting above the quiet murmur of old wrongs. Maya wandered among them with her camera, her shutter clicking with quiet intent. Her theme was clear: hands scooping food, clasping shoulders, setting down lemonade, the hands that built Maple Falls. Frank remained on the perimeter, near the trees. He leaned against a bench, arms folded, gaze soft. Now and then someone approached him, an old friend, a stranger. Each time, a few words were exchanged, a hand shook, a silence shared. Dee took the center again after dusk. The yellow string lights she'd looped through the trees glowed like fireflies. "Neighbors," she said, holding up a mason jar of sweet tea. "We're not here to burn anything down. We're here to weed out what shouldn't have taken root. This town grew from calloused hands and good soil. We're just clearing the vines so the flowers can breathe again." Applause rippled, gentle, then louder. Ethan didn't speak. He was still cataloging, sorting the stories in his head when an elderly man in pressed suspenders shuffled up beside him. He smelled of cedar and cologne. "You're Cole's boy?" he asked. "Grandson," Ethan replied. "Yes, sir." The man nodded, reached into the inside pocket of his blazer, and withdrew a weathered envelope. The paper had browned at the edges. "Don't know if it matters," the man said, "but I kept this. Didn't feel right to throw it away. She made me feel small for painting my door red back in '07. This was her apology." He pressed the letter into Ethan's hand. Signed, sealed, and a little too smug to forget. Ethan unfolded it. The letterhead read Evergreen Meadows HOA. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable, Margaret A. Hensley. He scanned the contents. In her tidy cursive, Margaret had written, "I acknowledge my overstep regarding enforcement language and accept that the board's actions were premature. I apologize for any undue stress this may have caused." Ethan blinked. His pulse ticked faster. The date? June 3, 2007. He stepped away from the tables, away from the conversations, and fished out his phone. Clint answered on the second ring. "Cole. You're gonna want to see this," Ethan said, eyes still on the letter. "It's dated, signed, and damning. They couldn't break the bylaws yet, but they could light candles." The first glow appeared on the porch of 113 Oak Hollow Lane, a single flame in a recycled mason jar, its light flickering against the siding like a pulse. Then another sparked to life across the street, tucked beside a hanging fern. By 8:10 p.m., Evergreen Meadows shimmered with more than 40 tiny suns, their golden halos pushing against the evening hush. Frank sat on his porch swing, his hands folded across his lap, the radio beside him quietly playing a soft instrumental of America the Beautiful. The breeze was gentle, brushing against the columns, teasing the scent of fresh-cut grass and cooling asphalt. Ethan leaned against the rail beside him, arms crossed, gaze sweeping over the neighborhood like a silent sentinel. "They did it," Ethan whispered. Frank nodded once. "They did." It had started 3 days prior with a question, posed more in passing than in planning: what if we just reminded them who came before? Frank had mused over his morning coffee, staring out at the flagpole still standing firm despite the deadline that loomed like a guillotine. By that afternoon, Ethan had drafted and printed a simple flyer on thick cream paper: "Lighting Memory, a tribute to those who stood before us. Friday, May 18th. 8 p.m., one porch, one light, one legacy." They distributed it quietly, mailboxes, doorsteps, slid into screen doors like love notes. Dee went house to house with a tote bag of votives and tea lights, each tucked into a paper bag weighted with sand. "No speeches," she said. "Just memory." And so here they were. From Margaret Hensley's house, the blinds parted. She had been circling the neighborhood earlier that evening, clipboard tucked under one arm, accompanied by a man with a GoPro strapped to his chest. She said little, just made notes, her eyes narrowing at each glowing jar, each small American flag tucked discreetly into planters or tied to porch rails. She'd passed Frank's porch without a word. He hadn't looked up from his glass of sweet tea. But now, through her second-story window, she watched. "Technically," Ethan murmured, "we haven't broken a single code." Frank chuckled, low and satisfied. "Silence says more than sirens." "Told you." From across the cul-de-sac, a child's giggle broke the quiet. A tiny voice asked, "Mommy, why are there stars on the ground?" The mother whispered something back, and the child pressed her face to the screen, watching the flames like fireflies. Behind them, soft sniffles. Dee stood on the walkway, hand on the shoulder of Mrs. Carmichael, whose eyes glistened behind thick bifocals. "I never thought I'd see this place feel like home again," the older woman said, her voice trembling. "Never thought it would be kind." Maya moved between porches, snapping photo after photo, candles reflected in window panes, hands holding hands, the soft glint of tears on cheeks. The next morning, she'd title her piece, "A Thousand Quiet Lights, Unity in Evergreen." Within hours, it would circulate on local networks, then get picked up statewide. Just past 9, the music from Frank's radio faded into a reverent stillness. Some candles flickered out, others stayed strong. No one rushed. No one left. They simply sat together. By dawn, Margaret had already drafted an emergency agenda. In the HOA office, she slapped a manila folder onto the desk. "I propose a motion," she said to the sleepy board members, "to establish regulation against unsanctioned light sources after hours, specifically open flame on porches. For safety." Walt Gentry looked up from his coffee. "You mean candles?" "If necessary," she replied. "The bylaws must evolve." Later that morning, Ethan returned from McAllister's cafe with 2 cups of coffee, steam curling from their lids. Frank took one with a nod and glanced over the ledger, whose headline read, "Porchlight Protest Stirs Maple Falls, Is HOA Overreaching?" Ethan chuckled. "She's moving fast." Frank didn't look up. Just smiled into his cup. "She's reacting," he said. "That means we're winning." Karen brought paperwork. The veterans brought the town. The wooden doors of Maple Falls Town Hall groaned open just after 8, letting in a current of spring air, and a current of people. Ethan entered behind Frank and Dee, his palm damp around the folded notes in his hand. Clint walked ahead in that slow, deliberate pace of someone used to courtrooms, his old Marine Division pin gleaming faintly on his lapel. They hadn't come for a fight. But they had come to win. The town hall hadn't seen a crowd this thick in years. Folding chairs had to be brought in from the Parks Department office. Elderly couples leaned on walkers and each other, murmuring, nodding, remembering. Children sat cross-legged near the back, swinging sneakers and sipping juice boxes. The flag behind the council table hung heavy in the still air, one corner caught in a sliver of light from the stained glass window. Outside, the last Friday of May moved quietly, warm and green. Margaret arrived late, as if orchestrated. Her navy slacks pressed crisp, clipboard clutched like a shield, 2 HOA board members flanking her with uncertain eyes. She did not look at the crowd. "Let's come to order," said Mayor Grant, a round man in a tan summer suit who looked more like someone's uncle than a public official. Today's hearing concerns a series of complaints filed against the Evergreen Meadows Homeowners Association, and a petition by residents requesting review and potential disciplinary action. Clint rose first. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "I present to the Council Exhibit A, a signed letter from 2007 in which Ms. Margaret Hensley, then Vice President of the HOA, acknowledges exceeding her authority in issuing compliance threats." He paused, letting that sink in. This letter predates the revised bylaw structure that is currently under review and therefore calls into question the process used to implement it. Gasps stirred like a breeze. Clint continued, submitting Exhibit B, a video clip. Maya had captured it, Margaret, outside an elderly man's porch, her words veiled but unmistakable. The board could interpret this as a safety violation, if certain individuals don't make timely adjustments. The man had since passed. Frank tapped Ethan's shoulder. Ethan stood slowly. "I'm not a lawyer," Ethan began, "but I am a grandson." He unfolded a creased page. "My grandfather raised the flag outside his porch every morning since 1989. This one." He lifted the photo Maya had printed, a snapshot from the album, Frank younger, back straight, hand on the pulley line, son behind him. "That pole is more American than any HOA paperwork." He read a short passage from the journal they'd begun collecting, words from a veteran named James Tully, who had died in 2014. "They told me the flag didn't fit the aesthetic. I buried 3 friends beneath that cloth." Silence. Even Margaret looked down. Dee stood next. Her hair was pinned in its usual swirl, but today, clipped to her blouse, was a faded military medical badge. She passed a thick sheaf of papers to Mayor Grant. 114 signatures, she said. Requesting a formal vote to dissolve the current HOA leadership and hold a new election. Margaret adjusted her glasses and stood, gripping the podium. Her voice tried to steady. This is a misunderstanding of procedural clarity. The board has followed all applicable updates. Safety and visual compliance are our only goals." Clint raised a brow. "You didn't notify residents of 3 bylaw changes. You threatened enforcement before review. And you buried dissent under paperwork." The room didn't clap. But the silence had shifted, no longer tense, but expectant. Mayor Grant called a brief recess. People whispered as the council stepped into the side room. Dee squeezed Frank's hand. Ethan closed his eyes and breathed slowly, his thumb brushing the edges of the folded photo. 10 minutes later, the council returned. "We've reviewed the evidence," said Mayor Grant. Effective immediately, the Evergreen Meadows HOA board is suspended for 30 days pending special elections. No further enforcement actions shall be taken in that time. A soft exhale spread through the room. Margaret didn't speak. She gathered her clipboard and walked out the back door without looking at anyone. Ethan turned to Frank, voice quiet. "We didn't shout. We stood. Flags and forgiveness. No fireworks. No speeches. Just flags, and something new in the air." The sky over Evergreen Meadows was a gentle, endless blue, the kind that only arrived on mornings like this, quiet, forgiving, and full of light. It was Memorial Day, and for the first time in a long time, no one waited for permission to hang a flag. At 6:58 a.m., Frank Cole stepped out his front door, steadying himself on the porch rail. His hands, though slower now, still knew the rhythm. Rope pulled taut, pulley squeaked. The flag, a fresh one, bright but familiar, rose with slow dignity. The sun caught the edges just right. Across the street, Alice Harper did the same with help from her grandson, a freckled boy who asked if he was doing it Marine style. Down the block, Dee straightened her posture, lifted a small flag into the window of her sunroom, and then stepped back in silent salute. By 7:15, 37 flags waved gently in front of 37 homes. No one had asked. No one had led. They had just done it. Ethan walked out with a steaming cup of coffee, compliments of Maple Spoon, which was serving free drinks and pumpkin bread to anyone who could name a family member who had served. He sipped slowly, watching Frank from the sidewalk. "You started this," Ethan said as Frank joined him on the lawn. "No," Frank replied. "We just remembered we could finish it." Inside the town hall, Maya was pinning the last photo to a hallway board titled "Echoes of the Meadow." The images, hands tying flag knots, weathered porches, laughing grandchildren, wrinkled faces holding memories, weren't edited for glamour. They were real. She stepped back, wiped a corner of her eye, and snapped a final shot, an old Marine cap resting on the bench outside the meeting room. At the community board near the mailboxes, Ethan posted a new section titled "Veterans' Voices." Pinned beneath it were scanned letters, typed recollections, and one wrinkled sheet written in pencil: "I fought in 66, came home in 70, and planted roses in 72. They told me roses weren't regulation. I never stopped planting." The benches around the park filled slowly with neighbors. Some brought folding chairs. Others just stood, coffee in hand. Dee led a quiet group toward the cemetery near Route 29, where they placed flags by the stones of those who had passed. No speeches. Only silence, and the sound of wind moving through the grass. Margaret was not seen that day. Word had spread that she'd moved in with her sister across town, quietly. A small sign appeared that morning at the far end of the park, beneath the willow tree, Karen's Corner. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Power must be held with grace, or it will be held against you." By mid-morning, Frank read from Ethan's newly self-published booklet, a collection of community stories called Meadow Stand Tall. He stood on his porch, voice steady. "It took candles, silence, and cornbread, but we came back home. Not to the houses, but to each other." Applause rippled, soft but honest. Then came the moment. Ethan returned to the side of Frank's porch, the one where the old poles still stood. He pulled from a small box the same folded flag that once earned a citation and carefully raised it again. Only this time, as it reached the top, claps echoed from every direction. A few saluted. Others just stood, hats off, hand to heart. Ethan looked out at the rows of homes. Windows open. Flags high. Frank leaned close and asked, "What's next?" Ethan chuckled. "Maybe, a book club." Somewhere in the distance, a radio hummed, "America the Beautiful." And for the first time in years, the wind that moved through evergreen meadows carried not just air, but a quiet kind of peace. On Memorial Day morning, the flags flew not just for fallen soldiers, but for neighbors who'd finally found their voice. What began with a single dispute had unfolded into something deeper, a quiet stand for dignity, fairness, and the right to belong. Rules weren't the enemy. But when twisted by the wrong hands, even a rulebook can become a weapon. Together, they reminded the town that unity, not silence, is what keeps a community standing tall. And sometimes, all it takes is one porch light, one letter, or one old Marine to light the way home.